What if the most important financial document in your life was telling the truth about itself the whole time? What if the paper tied to your home, the payment that follows families for decades, carried a name so blunt that once you hear it, you cannot unhear it? Mortgage. Not a modern slogan, not internet exaggeration. An old legal term from French that literally traces back to dead pledge. And almost nobody is taught that before they sign. If this makes you look at home ownership differently, stay with me, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes a 30-year mortgage is the only natural way a society can house its people, because what matters even more than the word is the system we forgot ever existed. You were raised to think the mortgage was simply adulthood, a rite of passage. Your parents paid one. Their parents probably paid one. Every month, money leaves your account with the same inevitability as gravity, and after enough years of repetition, it begins to feel like nature instead of policy. But it was policy, it was structure, it was design, and before that design hardened into common sense, millions of ordinary people used a different model entirely. Your great-great-grandparents did not need a giant national bank to enter the picture before they could own a home. In town after town, workers created building and loan associations, mutual cooperatives in which neighbors pooled savings and rotated credit through the community. In England, similar groups had already emerged in Birmingham in the late 18th century as building societies. The earliest versions were simple. A group of members paid into a common fund until enough capital existed to build or buy a house for one member. Then the cycle repeated until everyone was housed. In America, the first well-documented example was the Oxford-Provident Building Association of Philadelphia in 1831. It began with just 40 members. No Wall Street syndicate, no securitized debt machine, just people combining wages, patience, and trust. That system sounds almost too plain to be real, which is probably one reason so few people hear about it. Each member bought shares and made regular monthly payments into the association. When the pooled money reached the required amount, one member would receive the advance to buy land, build, or purchase a modest house. Then the pool would continue to refill, and the next member would take a turn. The savers were the borrowers, and the borrowers were still savers. Instead of profit leaking out to distant shareholders, the earnings circled back to members in the form of dividends, lower costs, and eventual ownership. The association did not need to wring every interaction for maximum extraction, because it was not a machine built for outside investors. It was a community financing itself. This mattered not only economically but socially. Credit was not reduced to a 3-digit score generated by someone who had never met you. Your reputation lived among people who knew your work, knew whether you paid what you owed, knew whether you disappeared when things got difficult, knew whether your family kept its word. That closeness did not make human nature perfect, but it changed incentives. If one household fell behind, the problem was not merely a line item on a spreadsheet. It was your neighbor, the man you saw at church, the woman whose children played with yours, the widow down the street. Foreclosure in that world meant a rupture inside the community itself. That changes the math. Building and loan associations spread with astonishing force across the 19th century. By 1890, they had reached every state and territory. By the early 1890s, the movement had become large enough to organize nationally through the United States League of Local Building and Loan Associations in Chicago. These were not fringe experiments. They became one of the main channels through which ordinary Americans pursued homeownership. Their operating costs were low. Many loans were effectively worked out over much shorter horizons than the 30-year debts modern borrowers accept as normal. The whole structure rested on mutuality, locality, and a simple premise that now sounds almost radical. Housing finance did not have to begin with a bank. And here is the part that makes the historical picture even stranger. For decades, the largest federally chartered banks in the country were not supposed to dominate housing at all. Under the national banking framework created during the Civil War era, national banks were sharply restricted in real estate lending. They could deal with real estate in limited ways tied to debts already owed to them. But housing finance as a routine business was not their domain. That world feels alien now because we live downstream from the reversal. We assume banks and mortgages belong together by natural law. They do not. That pairing had to be built. Look at the landscape before 1913. Federal revenue came mainly from tariffs and excise taxes. There was no permanent federal income tax on wages as Americans understand it now. There was no Federal Reserve managing the money supply through a central banking structure. National banks were not the unquestioned masters of home finance. Housing, in a profound sense, remained more local than national. Communities, mutual associations, state-chartered institutions, and other decentralized arrangements filled the space that giant banking systems would later claim as their own. Then 1913 arrived, and the architecture changed with breathtaking speed. In February, the 16th Amendment was ratified, giving permanent constitutional footing to a federal income tax. In April, the 17th Amendment changed how senators were chosen, shifting their selection from state legislatures to direct election. In December, the Federal Reserve Act created a central banking system. The point here is not that every reformer behind these measures was acting in bad faith. Many were responding to real breakdowns. Banking panics, unstable credit markets, widespread public anger at corruption, and the obvious unfairness of some existing burdens. Intentions were mixed, as they usually are in history. But whatever the motives, the structure of American finance did not emerge from 1913 unchanged. It emerged rewired. Buried inside that rewiring was a crucial opening. The Federal Reserve Act amended the rules enough to allow certain national banks to make farm real estate loans under specified limits. It was not the fully developed modern mortgage market yet, but the door had opened. A barrier that had held for decades no longer held in the same way. Once centralized finance got a foothold in land-secured lending, the long trajectory of local dominance became far harder to sustain. And here is the detail that should stop people cold. The broad homeownership rate did not surge after this new architecture arrived. Census data show a decline from 47.8% in 1890 to 46.7% in 1900, 45.9% in 1910, and 45.6% in 1920. That means the decades surrounding the centralization of finance were not some obvious upward march in ordinary families owning homes. If the story we inherited were true in the simple way it is usually told, you would expect the opposite. You would expect the bank-centered system to produce a clear and immediate improvement for the average household. That is not what the numbers show. To be fair, the older world was not paradise. Romanticizing it is lazy. New York tenements were brutal. Urban poverty was crushing. Landlords existed long before the Federal Reserve. Rent extraction existed long before the modern mortgage. Building and loan associations often worked best in communities where wages were steady enough for members to contribute regularly. They were not a magic wand for every industrial slum in America. But that is exactly why the real history is more unsettling than the fairy tale version. The cooperative model did not need to be perfect to matter. It only needed to be viable, growing, and capable of adaptation. And it was. By the late 19th century, building and loan associations had already begun evolving beyond their earliest terminating form. Newer plans allowed outside savers to participate, broadened the capital base, and made the associations more flexible in urban settings. They were changing with the country. They were not simply fossils waiting to die. They were displaced inside a policy environment that increasingly favored institutions with access to larger pools of centralized credit and stronger political support. The replacement system was also far uglier in practice than many people imagine. Early 20th century bank mortgages were often harsh instruments. Down payments could reach 50%. Loan terms were short, commonly around 5 years, sometimes longer, but still nothing like the fixed 3-0-year amortized structure later generations would know. At maturity, families faced balloon payments that many could not refinance if credit tightened. The modern borrower hears mortgage and imagines predictability. The interwar borrower often faced something closer to a time trap. Then the economy broke. By 1933, roughly 40 to 50% of home mortgages in the United States were in default. Think about what that means. Within a relatively short historical window after centralized finance had expanded its role, the housing system buckled so badly that the federal government had to build emergency scaffolding around it. The Homeowners Loan Corporation appeared in 1933. The Federal Housing Administration followed in 1934. Fannie Mae was created in 1938 to support liquidity for housing finance. The long-term fixed-rate mortgage that later Americans would treat as normal became common only through this New Deal and post-war redesign. In other words, the system that replaced local mutualism did not arrive fully functional. It crashed. And then it had to be rebuilt with layers of public intervention just to keep the structure standing. Ask the uncomfortable question plainly. Which model was really too fragile to survive on its own? The 19th century cooperative order financed homes for decades without requiring an entire alphabet of federal rescue institutions. The centralized mortgage regime entered, expanded, broke under stress, and then depended on continuous government support, guarantees, insurance, and market engineering to remain politically tolerable. That does not prove the old world should be copied mechanically in the present. It does prove the modern world is far less natural than we are told. Now add another forgotten piece. Land itself did not always enter family history through debt. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of public land to qualifying settlers, willing to file, reside, improve the claim, and stay long enough to earn title. The filing fee was tiny compared with the value transferred. Women could qualify. Immigrants who had declared intent to become citizens could qualify. Formerly enslaved people could qualify. Over time, more than 270 million acres passed into private hands through homesteading, about 10% of the land area of the United States. The policy was not symbolic. It was massive. It treated land, however imperfectly and unevenly in practice, as something that labor and settlement could convert into ownership without a lifelong mortgage to a national lender. That history matters because it proves Americans once lived inside more than one housing imagination. There was the homesteading path, in which residency and work could earn land. There was the cooperative path, in which neighbors pooled savings and financed each other. There were local and mutual institutions whose purpose was not endless extraction from household balance sheets. If you were taught that a bank-issued mortgage is the timeless gateway to homeownership, history says otherwise. Even the map remembers. Census records show North Dakota reaching an extraordinary 80% homeownership rate in 1900, a figure tied to conditions shaped by homesteading and decentralized land access rather than the mature modern mortgage market. The records remain. The land patents remain. Share certificates from disbanded associations still sit in archives. Evidence is not the problem. Memory is the problem, and memory fails in convenient ways. People remember the 30-year fixed mortgage as a triumph because, compared with the brutal balloon note system that collapsed in the Depression, it was a triumph. But that comparison is selective. It asks whether the redesigned centralized system was better than its own earlier breakdown, not whether the country had once supported broader access through entirely different principles. That missing comparison is where the silence lives. None of this means every old institution was just inclusive or scalable without limits. Some communities excluded outsiders. Some areas never shared opportunity equally. Homesteading itself unfolded alongside dispossession of native peoples and cannot be discussed honestly without that fact. Historical alternatives were real, but they were not innocent. Still, acknowledging their flaws is not the same as pretending they never existed. A flawed alternative is still an alternative. And once people forget an alternative existed, the present starts calling itself destiny. That is why the word mortgage hits so hard. Merriam-Webster and other dictionaries still trace it to Old French roots, meaning, literally, a dead pledge. The old legal logic was stark. The pledge was dead either when the debt was redeemed or when the claim ended through forfeiture. The term survived because it named the structure cleanly. Something ends. Something is extinguished. Either the debt dies or the borrower's claim collapses. The language is medieval, but the obligation is current. Today, housing eats more of household income than any other major expense for many families. Renters often help service someone else's debt. Owners can spend decades servicing their own. A home is marketed as security, stability, adulthood, dignity, and legacy. But attached to it is a financing structure so dominant that most people cannot imagine asking whether another one is possible. That may be the most successful part of the system, not merely collecting payments, but shrinking the public imagination until debt feels like nature, and yet the archives say otherwise. The buildings remember. The census tables remember. The old building society tradition in Birmingham remembers. Philadelphia remembers 1,831. The National Convention records remember 1,893. The Homestead files remember the millions of acres that moved to families without a bank in the middle. The New Deal agencies remember how badly the first large bank-centered mortgage regime failed. Even the word remembers. So the real question is not whether the past can be copied exactly. It cannot. The real question is why almost nobody is taught that housing in the United States once rested on more than one foundation. Why are people taught the rescue architecture of the modern mortgage state, but not the cooperative architecture that preceded it? Why do people know the monthly payment schedule but not the mutual associations that let neighbors finance neighbors? Why are they taught to debate interest rates, but not to question the assumption that centralized debt must always sit between a family and a home? Maybe the most radical thing in this entire story is not the etymology. It is the erasure, the disappearance of an idea from public memory, the proof that, for generations, Americans and Britons built institutions around mutual aid, pooled savings, and local credit instead of treating housing as a pipeline feeding distant balance sheets. The proof that land was sometimes distributed, not endlessly leveraged. The proof that home finance was not always organized around a lifetime relationship with a creditor you will never meet. If people remembered that, the present would look less inevitable. The mortgage would stop feeling like gravity and start looking like one arrangement among others. One system built by law, crisis, lobbying, reform, collapse, and reconstruction. And once something built is seen as built, it can also be questioned. So yeah, mortgage means death pledge. But the deeper truth is this. The word alone is not the revelation. The revelation is that generations before us had other ways to connect labor, savings, land, and shelter. They were imperfect. They were local. They were sometimes limited. But they were real. They housed people. They expanded. They left records. And then, over time, they were pushed aside by a centralized structure that still cannot survive without public support and still convinces millions of families that there has never been another choice. What would happen if every American learned that before signing? What would change if families knew that neighbors once financed neighbors? That land once moved through residence and work? That national banks were not always supposed to sit at the center of housing? That homeownership did not automatically rise when centralized mortgage finance did? Maybe nothing would change overnight, but memory would change. And memory is where every serious alternative begins.